Now let's get started with installation of Docker on Windows 10. Please note that Docker has updated their Docker toolset. So I highly recommend using Windows 10, Professional or Enterprise as a part of this lecture. As a part of the procedure, we are going to download the code samples for the exercises, install Visual Studio Code with the Docker plugin, and then install Docker. So let's get started. We're going to look at how we can install the code samples on Windows. Go to github.com/pick-to-learn, navigate to the Docker tutorial project and download the zip file with the source code. Now let's see how we can do that. Now let's take a look at how we can download the code samples. Go into github.com/pick-to-learn. You will find the Docker tutorial project. Click on it. Click on clone or download. Download the zip file. Unzip it. I'm just going to move it to the desktop. Now let's take a look at installation instructions for Visual Studio Code on Windows 10. Google on Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a project written to work on all operating systems by Microsoft. It's basically an editor, and it can be used with the Docker plugin to work on Docker projects. So let's see how we can do that. Now let's take a look at how we can install Visual Studio Code. Google on Visual Studio Code. Go to code.visualstudiocode.com. You should find the download for your operating system here. If you cannot find it, you might want to click on the download button on the top right hand corner. And then you can click on the link which is related to your operating system. I'm just going to install it. I'm just going to move it to a drive of my choice. Just click on Launch Visual Studio Code. Once you launch Visual Studio Code, you will have an option to install the Docker plugin. Click on the link on the bottom, which says Extensions. Docker apparently is already installed. If it has an update, it's going to show you. If you don't have Docker plugin installed, it's going to come up with an install icon. So let me just update it. It's saying reload, so I'm just going to reload it. And there you go. You have Visual Studio Code with the Docker plugin installed. So what I would do is I would open a folder, and in this case I would go to the desktop and open the Docker tutorial master. And then you'll have all the examples for this course here. So definitely take a look at it, and that's about it as far as installation of Visual Studio Code. Now let's take a look at Docker installation on Windows 10. As I had earlier stated that Windows 10 Professional or Enterprise at this juncture are the best operating systems to install Docker and work with the examples, because Docker Toolbox, which was supported prior, is no longer being supported by Docker. So go to docker.com, download the community edition for your operating system. Now let's see how we can do that. Now, to make sure you can install Docker correctly, you will need hypervisor enabled in Windows. So in order to do that, you can Google on Windows hypervisor enable. Click on either the first link which says install Hyper-V on Windows. I usually go in for the one which has the blog. So if you go back to the BIOS, make sure that virtualization technology is enabled. If your computer supports Windows 10, it is highly likely that virtualization technology is inbuilt toward the BIOS. I highly recommend and make sure that this particular feature is enabled. The second thing you want to do is to Google or not Google, basically go to Windows, look for turn Windows features on or off. If you click on this link here, and this is all documented on this website, you will see that Hyper-V should be enabled. If this is not enabled, Docker will ask you to enable it. So even if you have it disabled here, Docker is going to install fine, but then it's going to ask you if you want to enable Hyper-V at the end of the installation. It'll just restart your system and everything is going to be back to normal. So just keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at how we can install Docker. Go to docker.com and you should see a get Docker icon. You can also use that, or else you can use one of these links here which says get Docker Community Edition. I would prefer using this one here. Say get Docker for Windows. It says download from Docker store. So you'll see get Docker C for Windows. This is a stable channel, and then this is the edge channel. This has got all the cutting edge features, and this is the stable version. So I prefer downloading the stable version. Now that we have downloaded it, I'm just going to go ahead and install it. I'm going to check on launch Docker. It would ask you a question saying Hyper-V feature is not enabled. Do you want to enable it for Docker to be able to work properly? Your computer will restart automatically. And it also says Docker Toolbox will no longer work. Docker Toolbox is apparently an older version of the older version of Docker. So I'm just going to click OK. So my system did restart. Docker was installed successfully. I also got an icon here, which is a shortcut for both the Visual Studio Code and Docker for Windows. Now, if I navigate to the taskbar, you'll find that there is a Docker icon, and then it says Docker is running. If you click on this, you'll say about Docker, where you can go and check the version of Docker you're running. It says 17.03.0 CE, which is a stable version. And you can also upgrade Docker from within here. You can go into settings. It says start Docker when you log in. I would uncheck it. Automatically check for updates. I would keep it checked in. Send usage statistics. I would just keep it checked in. Shared drives, I will go over this a little later. Advanced basically says what's the allocation of the virtual machine in terms of the CPU and the memory. The virtual machine is basically sitting on this. The hypervisor was used for this basically. So we have two CPUs running with 2 gigs of RAM allocated for Docker. The network, the proxies, the daemon, you can set to advanced and basic. I'm just going to keep it as is. And then it says Docker is running. Now, restarting Docker should be done through this. If you want to set it to factory defaults, I highly recommend doing this. Clicking on this and then getting it reset to factory defaults. Now let's go check out to see if Docker is actually working. So what I would do is I'm going to open the PowerShell. This is Windows PowerShell. Right click and I'm just going to pin it to the taskbar. Click on it. Just do Docker version. So if Docker is installed correctly, you should be able to see the version here. Now, I'm just going to highlight this section here. It says the Docker server was 17.03.0.ce. C denotes the community edition. As you can see, the server is written in the Go language. The git commit, it's an experimental version. The client, on the other hand, has a version 2. So as you can see, it's Windows AMD 64. So that's about it as far as Docker is concerned. You can also try using docker-v to get a shortened version of the version. And that's about it for as far as installation of Docker is concerned. One last step before we wrap up the installation instructions is to get started with our first act of playing with Docker. So basically, just like every other programming language has a hello world, we're going to do a hello world with Docker. So open up the PowerShell on Windows and execute the following command. When I actually have it in double quotes, it's really not in double quotes. This will help you understand the interaction of the Docker client which you're running on the terminal. So that said, I am going to run that right now and give you a demo. So let's get started. The other thing I highly recommend doing is to again go back to the Docker on the taskbar. If you see the switch to Windows containers, we're going to be working with Linux images. So I highly recommend that be on Linux container and not Windows container. So if you by any chance see a switch to Linux container on this taskbar, I highly recommend switching. In this case, it's already in a Linux container, so I'm not going to do anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically navigate to the desktop where we have all our samples, and you really don't need to, but then I'm just going to run a few commands here. So in order to check if everything is working okay, I highly recommend executing this command, docker run -it hello-world, and then what it's going to do is it's going to look for an image locally. If it can't find that image, Docker is going to pull that image. This is a very important step in terms of finding if your Docker installation is working okay. So let me go through the steps here. It says unable to find image locally. So what it's going to do is it's going to connect to the Docker hub and pull that image. So here it's downloaded the new image. So it says hello from Docker. So that's basically the indication that Docker is working correctly. The second thing to note is this particular section here is very, very important to understand what is going on. So the Docker client, it says what happened along with this process. So it says the Docker client contacted the Docker daemon. The Docker daemon pulled the hello world image from the Docker hub. The Docker daemon created a new container from that image, which runs the executable that produces the output you're currently reading, which is in this case, hello from Docker. The Docker daemon streamed that output to the Docker client, which sent it to your terminal. So this, I highly recommend reading it a few times to get a feel of what's going on here, but you don't have to worry about it. As we go through the lectures, you will get a feel of what it is. So I will leave it at that for now. Thank you for watching the installation instructions. I look forward to seeing you in the future lectures.